All right, test.
Test.
Hello, everyone. We are here live. Can you see me? Tell me if you can see me.
A little bit off to the side. So if you were to move on just a little bit.
Okay.
Is it?
Yeah, now it's perfect.
All right, sweet. So my name is Ryan Knight, the co-founder of the Afro-Caribbean Business Network. We are here having discussions around the Black Empowerment Manifesto with its author, Errol Gibbs. So this will be more of an introductory, let people understand more about the manifesto, why it's important, and what is those next steps after it's been commissioned. So I'll give the floor to Errol, and then if we have questions, we'll ask questions. So the floor is yours, sir.
Okay. My job this evening is to try and give you an understanding of the manifesto, why we think it's necessary. I believe when we looked at where we are today in this time, in the trajectory of blacks on this continent and in the diaspora, and we have a good sense based on the economic impact that we have seen with the COVID. Issues that we've had in the past related to anti-black racism that continues to plague our society. And we have an emerging issue, the fourth industrial revolution, which will further exacerbate both social, economic, and other circumstances that are going to affect the black community. So in preparing the manifesto, we spent considerable time looking at the last 50 years, 1970 to 2020, looking at the archives of reports on how we attempted to address some of these issues. So we... Sorry, my goodness. Yeah. Okay. Yes, sir. So we looked at a significant body of reports, journals, books that were written on the subject. Some of these reports are commissioned by governments, some are by corporations. And if you look fundamentally through all the eras from 1970 to current 2020, one thing it's not a solid, sorry. I don't know, maybe the pocket perhaps. This way. Oh yeah, this weight. Okay. Okay, so I guess you can cut and I imagine you can cut and do different. Okay. Yeah, one of the things we will recognize is that a lot of the problems of the past keep reoccurring, and the fundamental solutions have generally been the same. So it is troubling that we have not really nailed on some of the issues that could truly mitigate this black disempowerment. So in order to counter, we had to look at how could we empower the black community, not just based on the short term, not just to address some of the issues that we are facing today, but issues in the longer term. Likewise, how do we create a strategy for the next 50 years? Because fundamentally, my belief is that it would take about 50 years for a complete transition to this new era based on the fourth industrial revolution that's coming like a Category 5 hurricane. The good thing is that it's slow. It's not like the pandemic, which just occurred and you have a short window to correct it. At least with the fourth industrial revolution, it will take a considerable amount of time to truly get acclimated, to build your hubs and to develop new forms of technologies to address it. So right now we're in a sort of a crisis situation, but beyond that dark cloud, there's a whole new world to explore. And we have to be prepared. So one of the things I would say in trying to address this new world, it will require change. It will require change in mindset. One of the things we have in the manifesto is about 11 mindset changes. But just to speak to you very quickly, I would say there are two things that helps to keep us stable, and they have also set us back considerably in terms of getting involved with mainstream activities and building great entities. And that is, we tend to be steeped in religious and culture, or religion and culture. And that's fine. But we need to look at another framework, and that is spirituality, culture, and the industrial mindset. The industrial mindset, or the industrial mind, or industrialization, is what gives us the capacity to build creativity, innovation, IPOs, which drives manufacturing. And the other thing with IPOs is that it allows us to gain capital to do the things that we need to do, and we are not limited to trying to raise capital from within the community. When you release an IPO, it could be anywhere. It could be on the TSX, NASDAQ. It could be anywhere. It could be in Europe. And there's an opportunity, if it is a proven technology, a proven concept, then it gives us an opportunity to raise capital. In looking at the manifesto, one of the way it's written, actually, I should talk about that a bit with you. The way it is written, it's 5 sections in the manifesto. Let's get that section and talk to you about it. It's in the back. Okay. I'm jumping ahead a little bit. So it's 5 sections. I'll give you a sense of what it is. The section 1, we talk about the writer's thoughts. And what these thoughts are is how do I conceive the way we try to solve problems. And what we found fundamentally is that a lot of the effort, the money, the time, the resources are not addressing the root causes of problems, but they actually attempting to address the symptoms of the problem. And so one of the things that we looked at is even violence, and where does violence come from? And it erupts every so often. There were times when we talked about the year of the gun. I think it was 2003, 2005, 2008, 2019. And every time we talk about the year of the gun, or we talk about the violence that's happening in our society, we go to the same aspects of our solutions. And it is troubling that when we look at the outcomes and how we move forward, it seems as though, and being prepared for the next time, you see we go back into the same mode and we write the same reports, and fundamentally it's the same recommendations. So the manifesto really attempting to look at, are there other ways of looking at violence, and do we really understand the nature of violence? There's a statement that says, in order to solve a problem, you have to measure it. The question is, are we measuring the real problem, or are we measuring the symptoms of the problem? Because violence is a symptom of a deeper underlying problem in the human spirit. Maybe I call it the aggravation of the human spirit. So the question is, what is it? And that is the depth of what the manifesto, the kind of thoughts I try to bring out in presenting the manifesto to you. Now, it also talks about the commission, and how did we arrive at the idea to commission the manifesto. Of course, I did not want to seem presumptuous and write a document without having a good sense of what community leaders might be thinking. So I attempted to do that, not by trying to reach out to all community leaders, but to put a central focus on a community that has some focus within the general community. So that really creates the lead into the community that I was looking for. And hopefully, with a good understanding of what the document is supposed to do for us, we will get buy-in from other communities. So that was the approach I took. But just to go back a little further, is I wrote a manifesto and published it in November, and it was 70 pages long, And the goal was to just put the manifesto out there and hope that the community will see the value, pick up the manifesto and move forward. But in speaking to Ryan, I realized that it was a good option for me because I did not have the time to get involved. But he felt that he could help to move it to the next level. We should go back and do further research, broaden the scope of the manifesto. So it went from 70 pages to 240 pages. So that tells you that there was a significant amount of work and research that was put into the manifesto to get us to that level. The reason being, it would not have been satisfying to either of us to put the same document out, maybe add a few pages, add some thoughts. That would not be doing justice to our community. So we went extra length and created a document, 15 very profound strategies that we believe can address. And I would be happy to say, and it's my fundamental belief, that we believe that these 15 strategies could address the majority of the problems that we have in our society. I would say all in the sense that there might be a host of other issues, but you would find that they are all comprehended in the 15. And we hang our hopes on that is a fact for us. Now, section 2 is a very short section, and it's called Starting from the Conclusion. And there's a graphic that I created in 2005, I believe. But all it does, it looks at what is happening globally, not just in Canada. And that is, as technology grows, as the population grows, and as technology, artificial intelligence, starts to underpin the technological growth in society, it reduces a significant number of jobs. Although it does create a significant number opportunity for other jobs. But the problem here is, are we able to rapidly transition the education system and our black community to move towards more science and technologies, mostly in the hard sciences, to benefit from the technological growth? Now, there's definitely growth in other areas, in medical and many other areas. My principal concern is industrialization, is the industrial mindset. And the reason is because it ought to be a natural. We were born with an industrial mindset. So it's not something we have to try to evoke by any particular means. We are all born with this industrial mindset. The question is, are we wise enough, maybe, let's say, to create the kind of ecosystem that will inspire a lot of or some of our youth anyway, to adopt the mindset? Now, the other thing, though, is we are without a choice. If you look at any of the powerful countries in the world, the two most powerful countries after the Reconstruction, World War I and World War II, was Germany and Japan. And Germany and Japan became the two most powerful manufacturing powers in the world. If you look at it from an American context, Booker T. Washington from the Tuskegee Institute, he has been talking about since 1903 to try to inspire blacks to develop an industrial mindset. He saw it as the way to overcome poverty and to become part of this massive economic ecosystem that have excluded us through the first industrial revolution, the second industrial revolution, the third industrial revolution. We have an opportunity now to be part of the fourth industrial revolution. So really, the choice is ours. We have had the message, 1903, we are in 2021, so what are we saying? 119 years, something like that. And the message has been brought to us in various ways. And I'll tell you which ways. One of the ways the message has been brought to us. If you have ever heard about the 5 dragons, now called the 5 tigers, I believe. Take Vietnam, for instance, and you know what happened in Vietnam. they were always bombed back out of existence. And today, you look at these 5 tigers, Malaysia, Taiwan, Vietnam, Singapore, these are very powerful countries. They do not have the resources that we have in the Caribbean, and any one of those countries are light years ahead of the Caribbean in economics, and the economics again comes from the industrialization, okay, and that means industrial education. It has a lot to do with the fact that we don't have the levers of power. Even though we may have some of the great ideas, like myself, I came out of the board of the industrial processes. I understand from Germany and the European models, and we could talk about it, but we don't have the levers of power to help to create that sort of ecosystem, which is so essential for development of black minds. But we came into a system that creates an ecosystem within the ecosystem that have consistently disempowered us. And we have not paid enough attention to understand that process, slow and systematic, because we have gained, that we have obtained some, I would argue, about $500 million in the last 50 years. But the question is, do we have a way of quantifying holistic, permanent, macro level job creation, wealth creation, digital and physical infrastructure? And if we ever sat down to do an empirical analysis, we might be quite disappointed in the fact that we did have the resources to build. Now, we could be a little bit kind in the sense that a lot of the money was spent in programs, in stopgap programs. So you do have to address fundamental problems of humanity. But at the same time, it is a little depressing that with the great minds we have in the GTA, that we did not understand the necessity for the industrial side, because the industrialization is what brings the resources to do every other thing that we need to do, to build capacity in a real way. Even though, again, I said we may not have in our hands the levers of power, we must understand the system and understand how to build within the ecosystem and still be able to survive economically. But we are not participating to the extent that we can and should in this modern world. Now we have an opportunity in the 4th Industrial Revolution. So when we come out of the economic devastation of COVID, where do we go? If we don't have a plan, we'll enter into a situation that could be 10 times worse than COVID. So we really have to consider that we are at an intersection. And this intersection means that we may have to make some big choices. And some of the choices would have to be looking at our funding models, looking at our programs, and are we going to continue for the next 50 years in this sort of repetitive mode? So what happens when another catastrophe befalls us? What do we do? So the manifesto is a forward-looking document. It is looking at the past, unsolved problems, current problems, and it is also looking at emerging problems that we are facing. Okay, well, I'll get back to that in a minute. But in section 3, this is one of the most significant aspects of the manifesto. Not necessarily the 15 strategies. Without someone reading the manifesto from cover to cover, it would be very difficult for them to understand how and why we have confidence that the manifesto can address in a very significant way the problems we are facing, even correcting some problems of the past, and definitely creating the impetus for developing strategies for addressing the problems in the future. So what Section 3 does, it provides what you call philosophical narratives. So Section 3 is asking the question, how did we get here? What might we have forgotten? What might we have overlooked? And what strategies have we put in place? And what were the results? Can we empirically measure the outcomes of those strategies? I believe we would find a lot of difficulties in doing this. And I believe we will also be somewhat disappointed with ourselves, because we as black people, we came to this country at a greater advantage to most other races. And we may not think about this, but it is a fact. We came to this country and most of us had a British education of some sort. We came to this country, we could speak the language. Most of us who came in the 60s, we came as independent immigrants. That means we were self-governing, we had great jobs, we came through the massive development of the power industry, so we came as engineers and teachers, and so we had the capacity, and we also had a lot of financial resources. We were the only game in town, so it was all about black empowerment. We may not have used the word a lot, but that's what it was about, and we had challenges. So no one would deny that we had challenges. We did have a lot of challenges, but these challenges were not difficult to overcome. The question is, for some mysterious reason, we ended up in a perpetual state of seeking and seem to be needing funding to do a lot of things that we could have done. And that independence would have really perpetuated us to do greater things. Like, when you start developing ownership and independence and autonomy, it does something that funding will never do for you. So I'm not against funding. In fact, we need funding, and I will advocate for funding until my final days. However, we have to look at different models. And we have never embraced, addressed, talked about in any significant way the need for what you call research and development funding. Because if we are talking about industrialization, to any extent, the backbone or the underpinnings of all that is research and development funding. Research and development funding allow us to be free and unleashed. It unleashed all the energies, all the creativities in us to do things that we could not otherwise do with program funding. Because under the banner of nonprofit, you are severely limited, and you cannot put any of that money into creativity and innovation. So you can see by intentionally, unintentionally, we have been operating with a bridle around our necks. We have been thankful for the funding, but the question we have to ask ourselves is, was it by intent? Is it by accident? Or is it our own fault as a black community that it did not occur to us that all around us there are corporations that are receiving research and development funding, and it's helping to fuel a lot of the technologies around them. So even though we may not own the corporations, we could have participated by engaging ourselves and looking at the technological trends and forming consortiums and what you call unsolicited proposals, and to get into the game. But we got into a perpetual cycle of funding, and it has, to some extent, it has crippled our progress. It has allowed us, of course, to do the stopgap programs. I have no problems with that. But the question is, at the end of the day, what happens when society starts moving away from us and our difficulties grow, and we don't have the sort of education, the technical education, or the salaries that would allow us to send our kids to the best schools, you can see the conundrum we would find ourselves in. So we are at a critical crossroads, and fortunately for us, Ryan came forward with the idea that we have to move along this path. Personally, we do not have a choice. We may believe we have a choice by creating new organizations every time new problems come up. But every time we create a new organization, we have violated the law of diminishing returns, which means every new organization diminishes the capacity of all organizations. And that can be measured empirically, because we use this law of diminishing returns. All large corporations do. And every leader of every organization ought to have some understanding, because he has the autonomy, everyone has the autonomy to form a new organization at will. But the question is, are we helping the black community? Now, we had a discussion yesterday, and someone shared with us that we need new organizations, or we need a lot of organizations because we have a lot of issues. And I said that, you know, we are speaking from 50,000 feet high, and we are speaking in two contexts. One, as an aggregate, I would argue, and we would have to do some empirical studies. As an aggregate, I believe we have too many organizations. And also, below this aggregate, if we look at the various areas within which they function, we'll probably find saturation in every area. And so that's why, as an aggregate, you have overall saturation, and it makes us less effective. And so many researchers have done this all over the world, in universities and colleges and everywhere. And that's why we come up with an actual law. It's called the law of diminishing returns. Okay, so it is not, a lot of us, as a matter of fact, in a more arbitrary way, we have already come to the conclusion that perhaps we have too many organizations. But we don't even know that we are actually speaking in scientific language when we're saying that, because the evidence will show it. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we are building, or the manifesto is saying we need any kind of oversight. All it's saying really is we need to examine the effectiveness, how we can build from a more unified position to do the stuff that we are doing. Now, in section 3, why it is so important is that we also looked at some things that we generally are oblivious of. And number one is the Constitution, or the North American constitutions, or I would say constitutions in general. We can look at the Magna Carta. I think it was in the 12th century, and we had, in Europe, I think it was in the late 17th or 18th century, and in the United States of America, again, it's the late 18th century, when these constitutions were written. If you look at the laws these constitutions promulgated, you will realize that today, indigenous peoples and blacks and minorities are suffering under the pen of those constitutions. So, I wouldn't want to go into what is happening that is kind of putting a damper on Canada Day, but that gives you some understanding of how constitutions have been used as a blunt tool against minorities. And the laws that emanated from those constitutions are even, in some sense, it's even more brutal, but of course there are a little more constraints. If we go back in the earlier centuries, there were no constraints. And we were at the mercies of the constitutions or the will of governments. Now, we are more benevolent in the behavior today, and we have laws that we can argue. but it's still a very slow and painful moving process for there to be the kinds of equity and the kind of egalitarian societies that we need to build in order to create equity. And since I'm on that point, I might as well bring up the question of procurement. Most of us have no idea, and I could say this very openly, I think we have no idea that procurement is probably, and I don't think I should say probably, I should be more specific. I believe procurement is at the apex of how we build equitable societies. I also believe that our country of Canada, we are probably sitting on $1 trillion of procurement yearly. I know that some banks, the procurement budget is about $65 billion a year. Imagine for a moment if this $1 trillion, a small community like the black community had access to $1 billion a year in procurement. Just imagine for a moment, would I be standing here speaking to you? The answer is no. No. There will be no need for all this employment equity stuff. There will be no need. Well, there will be a need for, of course, we need governance, infrastructure, and rules and all that stuff. But all the woes that we are facing, the diminishing of our ability to provide good education, good income, good salaries, the only thing we would have been missing is the genius of how to build infrastructure. And it's not like we are alone in the universe. We have seen large corporations, how they run, how they operate. We have models. I would suggest that a black panel or a black delegate leave on Monday morning and go sit with the leaders of Singapore, Taiwan, Malaysia, Vietnam, and sit down and find out how they're able to rise. Bring some Caribbean leaders with you as well and see how some of these countries with no resources, how they have risen, and they've risen through the industrial mind. All right, what is different? Now, one thing I would say, and I'm pretty certain of, almost 100%, that we as black folks, we have the same capacity or better, or we can match the skills of any country, any race on this planet. We know that for a fact. Myself, I came from Trinidad with a group of almost 35 young men. And all of us, we came and we walked right into some of the largest corporations. And we operated from some of the largest corporations. And it was like a breeze. It took no great genius mind to do it. We have the capacity. What we are missing is collective resolve. And I would like to say, the one thing that might make us a bit unhappy is that it seems to me we are only great when we are being disciplined. In other words, when we work in a large corporation and the rules are already written, the governance infrastructure is there. So we could boast that we are managers of banks and we are engineers and we are scientists. I have worked with scientists most of my life, since I was about 17 and a half, and that's a fact. I've worked in Pickering Nuclear as well, both in construction, design and development, and on special projects. So we've worked with all kinds of brilliant minds. So we are able, and we do have the capacity, the intellect, the education, but our education is skewed towards the soft sciences. And we must mean that for some of us, there's a dread fear of the hard sciences, the mathematics that drives, and physics, and all these things that drive engineering and geology and the harder sciences. And that is where, to a great extent, much of the wealth is generated, even as individuals. Even if we don't own corporations, we could live highly economic and self-fulfilling lives. So there's really no excuse for why we are here, why we are struggling, while we are... The only thing I would say is when we march and we cry out for oppression, that is the one area where I don't have much answers for, because the behavior of the majority culture should not come from the imposition of the will of law, but to build a good society, it must come from the imposition of the will of the heart. And that is a challenge that we may have to take up beyond the manifesto. But I would not say that, because one of the chapters in the manifesto really calls the clerics to respond to the question of leadership, because it's one of the central tenet of religion, of the Christian religion, is about leadership. And it's about God putting leaders in place. And if that's the case, why are these tenets not written into our constitutions? So I will leave it at that. So we also talked about politics. And I will not call for a political revolution, but I would say that I put little stock in politics. If we are to continue in the political realm that we live in across the world, it would be beneficial for all aspiring politicians, especially black politicians, to spend maybe 6 months or a year's tenure in a large corporations, so that they can understand the idea of a 4-year political cycle is irrelevant when you run in a country. It is the 10-year, 20-year, 30-year, 50-year long-range planning that is essential. If you walk into any war room in any large corporations, you'll probably see the cadence, 10 to 15-year plans, okay? Well, if you run in a country, it's the same. So every politician should have an opportunity to at least work in a larger corporation, try and understand supply chain integration, because you can be the best doctor, but if you're faced with a COVID-19 pandemic, the success of getting out of that pandemic may have less to do with medicine than to do with supply chain integration and logistics. If you can't get the supplies manufactured on time fast enough to the hospitals, distributed through the people who could write algorithms to give you a picture of what is happening and in your own minds, then we will end up with exactly what we just ended up with across the planet. So it's not a Canadian issue, it's a global issue. And it's a global issue because we tend to look at problems in isolation. And we tend to have a bias against people who are outside of your discipline. So a person like myself, for instance, and pulling Ryan into my circle and saying that the problems that we think are all social problems, there are some strategies that underpins or that can bring solutions to these problems that the social scientists may not understand. And some of these problems could be as simple as, do they understand 5th level risk management? That is what prevents planes from falling out of the skies, okay? But it may seem inconsequential, like all this sort of countermeasure action planning and all of the scope management and risk management and cost management and cost engineering. Very few might understand the difference between cost engineering and accounting. Many I've talked to have not heard about it, don't understand. So yes, you could be the best lawyer, the best doctor, but you have to be open, objective, and mutually respectful of other talents, other skills. And that is not native thinking to maybe 80% of the people on the planet. We tend to have a bias. And this bias extends within the black community in terrible ways, because it goes from color stratification to race, to color, to height. I was terrorized as a young man because I was always the oldest young fella from school when I was probably only 3 or 4 feet and already 15 years old, and everybody 15 years old already 5 feet tall. Okay, so that means terror. Okay, that's what it spells, terror. So we do have this bias in almost every aspect of human civilization, and it's particularly pronounced in the black community. We all know it. We see it in every aspect of our lives. We see it in religion, religious bias. We see it in the bias between Africans, African Americans, and Caribbeans, folks from the Caribbean. It's everywhere. It's in different shades, like I said. It's in every aspect of our lives. So some of the things that are really affecting us as black people are much more fundamental, much more elementary than we think. And unfortunately, we tend to rely on others. So we live in this matrix. And there are gatekeepers in the matrix, if you want to think of it this way. And here we are as black people in this matrix. It's a matrix that was not designed for our empowerment, whether by accident or design, whether it's intentional or unintentional. But when we look at the history of racism, we know that there's an element of intentionality that cannot be argued. If you look at all the articles of human rights commissions, UN reports, we know that that is evident. Knowing that doesn't mean we have to start a revolution. Knowing that doesn't mean we have to believe that we could never rise to greatness. Knowing that means that we have the knowledge to move forward. That is what the manifesto is trying to do. And the manifesto is asking us to be open, to be objective, and to be respectful of the work that Ryan and I are attempting to do. Someone said to me yesterday, why can't we keep this knowledge and build, just like Elon Musk and these fellas, right? They build the great machines and then it surfaces. Why can't we build a great machine using the manifesto? Ryan and I talked about, this is a funny one. We call ourselves the Wright brothers. Well, I say the Wright brothers, and sometimes I'm writing as though we are the Wright brothers. I'm forgetting he is Ryan Knight and I'm Errol Gibbs. But that's okay. In 1903, the first flight by the Wright brothers were 12 seconds. 12 seconds. So in attempting to have a community consultation on the manifesto, to me that is equivalent to our 12 seconds. But if you step forward into the future, in 2018, the same 12 seconds by the Wright brothers became 19 hours and 16 minutes flight from New York to Australia. What's the capital of Australia again? Sydney. I think it's Sydney, yeah. It became a 19-hour uninterrupted flight to Sydney, Australia. Oh, just approximately 11,000 miles in a Boeing 787-9. So, what we are doing, or what we have done, or we are attempting to do, is to put you on the flight deck of the manifesto. It's up to you. So we are putting you on the flight deck, and what we are saying, this is our 10 seconds flight, or 12 seconds. And if you stick with us, we will make that 19.16, 16 minutes flight, and we'll take you across the Atlantic. But you have to make the choice. Now, a young man said to me yesterday, he said, why can't we be like Elon Musk and these guys, man? Be built and then we surface. And my answer was a sad commentary of who we are. And that is, I said to him, If we could find 5, 10, 15, any number of wealthy or semi-wealthy men, black people, we could do exactly that. We could build the complete infrastructure for the manifesto, which is the foundation of it is the Canadian Black Empowerment think tank, 15 to 20 advisory council. We could build it, and then we could surface within 6 months, within a year, and we'd be a whole new group of people in this country. That is guaranteed. There's no ambiguity in that. We could deliver an organization that is a wealth creation organization, and we could do it in a very short term. But going back to the reason why everything we do, we have to put it in the hands of others, because not only do we not have the, well, I wouldn't say we don't have the wealth, because there's another way we can accumulate the wealth. We could do it through GoFundMe, or we could do it through great generosity of our people. If we have 250,000 people in the GTA, making a wild guess now, don't hold me to that, $1, that would be $250,000. That could get us building all the infrastructure. Who cannot afford $1? I mean, it's hate to talk in such ridiculous terms, because you and I know if you want to build anything of substance, anything that's important, it requires some kind of a sacrifice. In my own life, I use all kinds of techniques for making sacrifices. If I buy something that of some quality, I would say to my wife, let's go ahead and buy it. But for the next month or 2 or 3, there are other things that we do that have little consequence in terms of our development. So we'll just cut back on those things. And I'm serious about it. Sometimes we go out and we buy food often, and something comes up. Maybe it's a book, maybe it's given someone a gift or something. And then I'll say, look, we'll balance it, and here's what we'll do. And so we can all make the sacrifice. The question is, do we really care about the progress of our people? I'll say something to you that I shouldn't say it, but I'm going to say it. I have a friend who says, Errol, you need $100,000 to work with Ryan to start building this enterprise. And you know what he said? I can give it to you, but I won't. He said, because this is your race, this is your culture, this is your people, these are black people. I won't tell you what race the gentleman is, but he wasn't a black man, and I had nothing I could say, because if it was being done for his race, he probably would give me the money even though I'm not his race. Okay? So what he's saying is to us is, they could sit around and cry, we could hope, like the church tried to instill hope in us, but hope without a strategy is no hope at all. Prayer without a strategy is no prayer at all. And prayer that is not fervent and coming out of righteous mouths, no prayers at all. So when we ask, why is the black community in the state that we are in? The answers are simple. There are no complex answers. What is complex is working in a nuclear reactor next to a spectrum engineer. Okay? That's complex. I had my turn of doing that and wondering, what am I doing here? Okay? So that's complex. What is complex is working in the United States, working with Fortune 500 companies, and trying to write algorithms, trying to develop analytical systems for integrated resource management. That is complex. How we got into this state and why we continue to perpetually be in this state and depending on others, it's all in our hands. We either love it or we are not listening to the great minds that are here to enable us. today my family is moving, and for 4 days they were moving, and I am supposed to be the head of this family, and here I am. And where was I yesterday? Yeah, and I try to get them to understand, okay? But sacrifices? No. So we are in this state because of no one but ourselves. And we have a choice that we can set a goal for ourselves. 5 years, here's where we're going to be. 10 years. We got, what do we call it? Black History Month. And we celebrate mostly all the cultural aspects of Black History Month. And the question I ask is, where's our Black History Month scorecard? So we can empirically measure the progress we are making. How do we know we are making progress? And if we are making progress, why are we at the mercies of every other entity on this planet? Why are we at the mercies of government funding? And we need the funding, and I would not advocate for no funding. But the question is, are we building in parallel? Are we building the infrastructure so we become sustainable? And that doesn't mean we'll never need funding, because there'll always be a need for stopgap programs. But our goal should always be, whether we attain it or not, is self-sustainability and self-governance, some autonomy. So, getting to that point, I get to section number 4. And section 4 talks about a portfolio management office that might be new to some. So, I'll talk about section 4 and section 5 at the same time. So, section 5, we offer 15 innovative strategies. And these strategies addresses all of the major issues that we have in the Black community, or perhaps in any community, but to greater or lesser extents. So we looked at, again, we did not come to the conclusion by a whim. We have looked at 50 years, I said earlier on, we have looked at 50 years of the records of what transpired in this country regarding our people and how we try to solve the problems that we face. And like I said, we saw a dizzying repetition of the same similar recommendations. And we have looked at reports and books and journals and white papers, and we know that they cost millions and millions of dollars. And the latest report, I would say right now, I think it's a 3-year report, I think it's 2019 to 2021. It's a $47 million initiative. And when you look at the headline, what are we talking about? An anti-racism act supplemented by anti-racism secretariat and all the other stuff. Imagine, we live in a world that sometimes we consider it a Western Christian democracy. And in the 21st century, we are still writing Anti-Racism Act. I would like this whole community, I would like the whole country to think about that for a minute. In this so-called enlightened era, we live in an era where we have some of the greatest universities right here in the GTA, well, in Ontario, let's say, or across Canada. Some of the finest universities, some of the finest schools of management, okay? We are at the center of the two of the greatest economies, the center of high technology. We boast our religious heritage. And in 2021, we are talking about writing an anti-racism act. How does anyone explain that? How does any person, white, green, black, pink, whatever, how do you explain that? Well, there's a way you could explain it. Take a look at the manifesto. Read it from cover to cover, and it might give you an understanding that why, with all our great brains, our great talents, our great institutions, why we are at this stage where we are still trying to build a humanity. Go back a few years and we probably had what? I don't know, 5-10 million refugees. Today we're up to what? Something like 80 million. That sounds like progress to me, but in the wrong direction. Right? We are spending what? $1.78 billion. This was $19 trillion actually. I think it was 2014 statistics. On the war industrial complex and the prison industrial complex, and also on education. So, how did we get to this state? So we are no great geniuses or anything like that. All we have done was looked at the evidence and we penned a manifesto, and we believe that it has the capacity to give you an incredible understanding of why we are here and how we could move to a new frontier. So the 15 innovative strategies requires something more foundational to implement them. So what we call for is a Canadian Black Empowerment Manifesto. But the manifesto, a Canadian Black Empowerment think tank. So the think tank are the great minds, the great thinkers, the great innovators, and some not so great, but they bring things, other aspects of morality and other great attributes to making the think tank a powerful tool. But underpinning the think tank is the PMO. And the PMO is really the industrial or the genius part of this whole enterprise that we are building, because it allows a few individuals to help us to build the incredible databases that we need to bring this to reality. So there's so much that I could talk for hours and hours about the importance of having the think tank and the PMO. We may not have heard about the PMO, but every large corporation, in fact, let me just say this. Every large corporation moving towards that same model. I personally wrote a paper on how do you build these PMOs to deal with supply chain integration, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. How do you integrate among corporations that are all over the world? How do you integrate? If you're building a transmission in General Motors or Chrysler or Thyssen, parts are coming from sometimes all over the world. How do you coordinate the timing and then the assembly? And then who's responsible if something goes wrong? How do you manage that? Well, I was involved in some of those, designing some of the processes to look at these situations. And I actually wrote a paper and delivered it at a global conference in Houston, Texas in 2000. Okay? Because that was my specialty as a senior process designer. So what that means, maybe nothing to the community, but what it does mean, that it doesn't matter what problems you have in our community, we could find processes to design it out. That is a fact. This is no mystery, there's no guessing, no. There are processes. The Japanese are good at that. They are good at saying it takes an hour to do this job. We could find a process that might limit it to 3/4 of an hour, but guess what? Higher quality. So not just the process. If we don't understand these things in the community, well, guess what? Perhaps there's someone out there who does. Just be open, objective, mutually respectful. That's all. That's all it needs. No one is asking for $450 an hour to do this stuff. This is the kind of money you have to pay out there, right? And you're getting it from your own family in the matrix. But guess what? Going back to the matrix, we'd rather go to the gatekeepers than to get together in the matrix and say, is there a better way? Because the answer I talk to the gatekeepers appears to be more expedient. Because if I cry to the gatekeeper, he may give me some money. But if I have to deal with those within the matrix, we may have to work. We may have to do some real work. We may have to understand things that we never want to understand, we don't care to understand, but we don't know it is essential to understand. All right? So, having said that, I will add a little bit about me again. When I was 18 years old, my love was always for books anyway. And one of the first books that motivated me, if it wasn't in fine print, would have been 1,500 pages long. And the book teaches you how do you manage these massive entities like a power plant. How do you control it? Like, how do you control the Pickering nuclear power plant? How do you control Lakeview Power Plant, one of the biggest thermal plants in the world? They now pulled it down, okay? Right now, as we speak, one of the largest nuclear rehabilitation program is taking place right here in Ontario, in Bruce Peninsula. How many young people have we taken to see the project and how inspired they could be? How many young people we have taken from the cities to the James Bay project in Quebec to blow their minds? They would never want to come back to the concrete jungle. They'll suddenly want to be engineers and what have you, okay? How many people, young people we have taken to NASA? We have got the money, so that's not the issue, okay? We just spent $47 million to write recommendations that we have written about 15 times before, okay? So the money is there. There's not a question of money. Money is really the issue. What is the issue might be how money is either distributed or are we able to leverage the money? Now, let me go back to something because I'm reflecting on yesterday's and today. We asked the question, why so many organizations? And they said, someone said, like, why 200? Why 250? And the answer is always the wrong answer. And the answer is that we got so many problems to solve, and most of them, the basis of nearly all the problems are economic. And that's the one thing we must be clear. We're not solving problems with men with heart attacks and prostate cancer and brain surgery. It's all economics. Kids that daycare, simple things, right? But that's, and racism, meaning that no equity in terms of employment and all that stuff. And I want to say something about employment equity. I hope I remember. But anyway, so we're saying we have all these problems to solve, so we must have all these organizations. And I asked Ryan today, I said, Ryan, our work calls for 15 innovative strategies, which is theoretically it's saying 15 major organizations. But it doesn't mean we only need 15 organizations. What it might mean, it may be 15 foundational organizations, and there'll be lots of supplementary and other organizations. But the point is, the other point that I find a bit troubling, if I may step away a little bit from that, is when I think of a large corporation, and there's some large corporations, 250,000 people is a few people. All right? Some large corporations, they go up to 2 million. When you look at Walmart and Amazon and these companies. And you know what I thought for a minute? What if we had one brilliant black man in Ontario? Do you know he could theoretically hire every black person in Canada? Now, again, something I want everyone to think about. Take, for instance, we just go in a little while here. Think about Bezos with Amazon. Think about IBM, with the 98-something thousand people, right? Think about these companies. What if we had one man, just one black person in Ontario, and we supported him or her? I guarantee you one person could hire everyone in this GTA. But we don't have that kind of visionary mindset. And we don't have that kind of thinking. So really, when you look at our problems, it's got nothing to do with money. Absolutely nothing to do with money. Money will come as a derivative of what we do. So when we scream money is the issue, no. The first imperative is not money. The derivative is money. And that will come naturally. We don't even have to think about it. It will come naturally. I knew I would have a good life. I didn't have to worry if money will come, although I was a poor kid. But I never worried about money, if money will come. God is my witness. I never worried. Because I knew there's a path to money. The right form of education, some luck, and I don't put luck, give luck any big stock. I don't put a lot of stock in luck. Okay? But the right kind of education, a genius mind, right? A good heart, a righteous heart, money will come. I have been retired, by the way, for 20 years, and there are studies that show when someone reaches 75 years, the percentage that are not living the kind of fulfilling life, and I am retired at 20 years now, I am living a life that is quantum leaps happier, better in every aspect than when I was working. So who says about money? And it's not like I have millions of dollars. No, not at all. I made the proper accommodation. 5 kids, 10 grandkids, 1 great-grand. And my goal is the last 5 will be scientists. Because the first 5 went to university except 1. The second 5 went to university except 1 who went to college. And the last 5 will have to be, or hell to pay. They'll be scientists. And we'll guide them and show them how to make it happen. Okay? Sometimes your kid may not even know what he or she is capable of. And sometimes they need that oversight to help them, give them the right guidance. It's not about money. And I'm not diminishing money because in our manifesto, we have a section on money. So we're not being hypocrites. No, we know that it's important. Okay?
Before we take any questions, we talked about employment equity. Did you want to touch on that?
Employment equity?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Okay. Back in maybe the 90s, I think. I can't remember exactly. And I'll show you why discipline is the key, okay? A whole group of us, the blacks in Ontario Hydro, they had blacks all over Hydro. And we were having some issues, of course, with upward mobility. You know, how do we move in the companies and stuff like that. And we had a choice to go crazy and carry on and whatever. But what we chose to do was to bring some of the best minds together, about 6 of us. And our goal was we will meet from 6 to midnight every Friday for a period of time. And just like Elon Musk and these guys, we will build a report and we call it a pattern document. And in this document, we interviewed quietly everyone, the black folks, different levels, engineers, everyone. And we tried to understand the culture, the behavior, the hiring practices. And our report, we got it signed by one of the leading human rights lawyers at the time, and a guy named Raja Anand, an Indian chap. And we got him to look over it for us. We signed it, and we took it to the Hydro board and asked them to look at it. We didn't go there crying and saying we have problems, crying in our soup. No, we found a solution, and we took the solution to them. As a result of that, it changed everything. It changed everything. And that is the way you solve problems. You know, intellectually. Sometimes you need mayhem and madness. But I am not on the mayhem and madness side. I am for let's find ways to design processes. Let's find ways to articulate at a high level. And sometimes I write and people say, I don't want to read this stuff. Well, whenever I ask a young person, what grade are you in? Which I do all the time, and they say grade 5. I say, what grade do you read at? And he say grade 5, and I say, no, it should be at least grade 7. So you can imagine if you're grade 12, I'm telling you, you should be reading at second level university. What else? What else? So, but if you get the kid used to saying, I'm grade 5 and I read grade 5 books, that to me is a travesty. Who is his parents? Right? You should be reading grade 7 and 8 books. And by the time you reach grade 8, if you're not graded grade 12 books, something is wrong with our family, something is wrong with everybody in that house. Okay? And that's the standard. You just have to set standards that are not considered the norm. Now, in our manifesto, we are tough, very tough on education. And our standards are higher than the Board of Education standards anywhere in this country. And our standard says every kid, 100% should graduate. And I read an article by the board of the Toronto School Board, and they were applauding themselves because they're now up to 85% graduation. And I thought, what a travesty. Because if you look at those who did not graduate, then it might make you feel a little sad. Okay? So what we recommend is simple. Start teaching with emulators and simulators. Doing things to these students to make them more curious about education. Don't get stuck in academic information literacy. That is crippling creative minds. Okay? You need to have academic information literacy standards. No doubt about that. But much beyond that, there are various patterns of learning that can be influenced by other modules. There's a word they use there, but anyway, other ways of developing programs. I'll give you an example about policing and about how we could reduce a lot of this violence. Have you ever thought about making one of these gunslingers a police chief for a day? Where he sits in the police chief desk and he hears about what's going on. We take them on the beat. Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever thought about a kid who's failing in school and put him in a simulator, 16 years old? We just bought a simulator last week for grandson. And we are going to make sure he could fly across the Atlantic. Right? Soon, and we are talking within weeks, we want to see him fly across the Atlantic. Okay? So what I'm saying is, what if the schools, or not even the schools, special schools had simulators and emulators, and you have a 16-year-old kid fly across the Atlantic. He was the flight captain. What do you think we'll do to that kid? What do you think? We are kidding, my friends. I might be a voice in the wilderness, but I'm saying to you, everything that I speak, I've demonstrated in some ways. And I've been respected by many communities. I've been invited by Swamis to India. Okay? I had a Chinese senior engineer took me under his wings. Okay? I have had a scientist from India, and he put his hands around my shoulder every time we come out of a meeting. And his words will be, Errol, you are a hero. And the only reason he would say that, not because he thought I was bright like him or anything, the courage to stand in front of scientists and explain how we are developing a system to manage, and this was like $100 million system, to manage some of the work that we are doing, how to manage the cost, and we're using cost management techniques, cost engineering techniques, like cost contingency. How do you calculate contingency? And we had formulas for that. So if you start a business, depending on the size of the business or the capital cost, what should be the contingency in resources, in products, in everything? Do we do that in business today? Soon as something go bump in the night, the business fails, right? So if we don't know this stuff, find out. It's not all about, you know what, my mom could cook, let's start a business. It's not the way it works. There's a cost to doing business, all right? And there's a methodology for establishing business. I can guarantee you right now, I could throw it out right now pretty willy-nilly, that probably 80% of all businesses are not properly capitalized. I will say, you go take a look at it yourself. I can ask you a question right now. If I ask a business person today, go across this whole city and ask the question, is your business operating at its optimum? Could anyone answer in the affirmative? That is the question we have asked, and I ran a seminar in Oakville on that very question to a heap of businesses, and it was called, I think it was just called business optimization. How do you know your business is fully optimized? I guarantee you, I could ask 1,000 people. I'd be lucky to find one person to say, yes, my business is optimized. And if perchance he says my business is optimized, then I'm going to ask him for the parameters that led him to that answer. And I guess what? You won't be able to answer. I'm telling you because I know I've done it. That's what I do. All right? I used to do. I don't. Only if somebody asked me to do something. So, even a small business, you have to ask the same question. Now, I guarantee you again, that I would rarely find a business today that could tell me that the budget they started with is what you would call a definitive budget. Because the average person uses the word budget in a very arbitrary way, and they use it generically. You cannot. Budgets are either, what the heck, I'm teaching cost management, or are we talking about a manifesto?
Well,
Budgets, no, I'm kidding. Budgets, let me just say this quick. Budgets are either order of magnitude, intermediate, or definitive. There are some projects, if you understand why projects fail. The biggest and worst of all was the Boston Turnpike project. And then we could look at the waterfront project here, we could look at revenue kind of project here, and we could look at any project. And what you'll see is the over budget, cost overruns, and sometimes years overruns. Some projects even run billions of dollars. You know why? Because there are some projects, and you could only get to a definitive budget when you get to about 75% of the project. Most people think, here's the budget. Whenever someone asks me if I want to do something, what's my budget? I always wonder, like, what the dickens he's talking about, or what does he expect? Because I'm kind of kidding, that I want him to clarify what he's really looking for. Because you think about anything you're doing. Start painting your house. Before you know it, you have no contingency. You want to change the color. You want to do all kinds of stuff. Happens to all of us, right? Doesn't matter. You take your car to the garage, you say, I'm going to do an oil change. What happens? The guy comes back and says, you need shocks. You had any idea? Good. So if we don't inject high-level intelligence into what we're doing, we will consume so much of our resources into damage control and countermeasures that you would probably end up with no money for your retirement. You've got to be wise. You've got to think about these things. Our manifesto will answer all these questions for the black community. We will create wealth for the black community because we will decree that we should get a group of guys together. We would look at all that we do, and in every area we will declare that we should have an IPO in 5 years. There's a bunch of engineers, they call them pilots, right? Give us an IPO in 5 years. There's got to be something. There's got to be an app or something you could build, put out there. Okay, I follow a young man called Austin Russell, the youngest billionaire in the world. He did it in 8 years. The guy was 19 years old when he dropped out of university. But of course, he was a technical person. He looked at the autonomous driving cars, all right? And he looked at the technology called LiDAR. I just bought some of his stocks. Can't afford much. I bought 50 shares. Okay? And I'm betting on him because he's challenging Elon Musk. So he IPO 8 years ago, released the IPO. He's worth $2.5 or $6 billion today. So that one guy could have taken care of the whole black community if he was black, and if we went and appealed to him and cry, right? But then he might say, you guys didn't help me. I begged you. I begged you to help me develop this. So that's why we become selfish, because we don't get the help. So what we do, we all march off into the horizon and try to do stuff ourselves. That can't work. If it worked in the past, it's not going to work in the future. That's absolute guarantee. We are not living in yesterday's world. Okay? Now, let me make sure I finish with this. Okay, and then I'll come back to something, or you can start asking me some questions. Section 6 is the bibliography. So, should anyone imagine that we started writing this manifesto without doing any research? There are two things I want them to know. We have over 6 pages of bibliography. And we have something like 171, I believe. I should get the manifesto. Anyway, footnotes. So look at the last footnote. Tell me what the last footnote is, the number. So the last footnote, and on top of that, we have in-text footnotes. And we probably have an equal number of in-text footnotes. What that means is that we have done an enormous amount of research. You're probably looking at about 2 or 3 PhDs put together there just based on the amount of research that we've done. And we did all this for love of black community. And we may suffer for all that love, because it might break our heart that we don't get the support we need to help you. To help you. I'm retired, 20 years. None of my kids were affected by COVID. None of my family that I know affected. They had great jobs that insulated them. Do I have to worry about this stuff? The answer is yes. It can't be no, because I belong to the family of black folks. So I don't have a choice either. All right? So, the last footnote, I forget. I should just keep it in my head, because ever so often I want to talk it. Okay, so what I will... Okay, so when you find it, you find the last footnote? I think it was up to... No, the footnotes. If you keep going back to the last... sorry. Yeah, I have to go back a bit. Okay, after... So somewhere from here, start seeing the numbers of the footnote. So it's probably what, 100 or something? 171. 171. So 171 footnotes. And that's footnotes. But then we have in-text references, which is probably maybe, 50 or 60. Whether that tells you something for any articulate reader, that says something, okay? It says that the person is trying to validate their work. They're just not writing. If you go in there, you'll see a reference to the 5 tigers or the 5 dragons. So anything we have written about, we talk about moving away from traditional politics and moving to skills management of countries. Politics today, and perhaps always, is destroying countries. It's putting people at odds with each other based on race, culture, religion, color. Well, that system is lacking in intelligence. We are using great minds, and we are actually abusing great minds, because those great minds could be looking at longer term survivability of humanity. But we're spending so much time in conflict with each other based on race and culture. And even in homogeneous countries, we have the same issue. Whether it's a homogeneous country, like Africa used to think was one of the most homogeneous country, actually, it's North Korea. All right? And it was North Korea, South Korea, Japan. Now, Africa to some extent, but because of the various cultural and religious and all that, it makes it very difficult. Shouldn't be, but difficult to manage. Canada will become a difficult country to manage because it's non-homogeneous. America is unmanageable because it's non-homogeneous. Okay? So in other words, they want to make America great again. So if we can get rid of all the dark-colored people and we have only Caucasians, maybe by some mystery it's going to be a great country. I don't understand that. Maybe there's something I don't get there. But we have, why it's going to be more difficult for us? Because there's more competition. Everybody talks about China. What are we going to do about China, right? That's not China's fault. I applaud China for its genius. Because since we're talking about black people, I want to feel free to say this. When we were put on the ships in the 16th and 17th century by the Jesuits, Dominican and Franciscan monks, we were baptized into Christianity. And the so-called Christians violated one of the most sacred tenets in Christianity. And it's not what people might think, something so theological. It's quite simple. It's Galatians 6:10. Simple statement. Do good to all, especially to those that are of the household of faith. And what that means is that if I'm a Christian and you're a Christian, right, it doesn't mean I must despise this young man, I must do good to him, but especially to you. So how did we end up with 400 years of brutality after we were baptized? Because we are now become of the household of faith. Well, the one question I'm asking to my Christian brothers and ministers is to help us to understand this, because this is a critical part of our survival, because we don't have power. And if our ministers of the gospel cannot help us to understand, or help their white brothers to understand that something is amiss, then they are betraying us. They are betraying the black race. They are betraying black humanity, because they are the ones who call themselves God's messengers. They are the bishops, they are the doctors of theology, and we are asking them to help us to understand. We are asking them to help us understand something even more critical than that, and it's the question of leadership. Who appoints leaders? And if God appoints leaders, let's look at the American discourse. Did he appoint Trump? And if he appoint Trump, did he remove Trump and appoint Biden? Or did he only appoint Trump? Like, we want some explanations, because these are things that are hurting us as a people. And if no one is asking, let us black great genius minds ask the question. And let's ask them calmly, and let's ask them in a very resolved way. Okay? So this manifesto is not what maybe the majority of people are thinking. Just a book about how to make money maybe, or how to solve this or that problem. We haven't seen the potency of this manifesto, because it has 1,000 miles to go. No, what did we say? 19 hours, 10,000? Yes, it has 11,000 miles to go to get to where it ought to be. So anyone thinks it's a document to be very casual about, they're wrong. So I'm declaring right now to Ryan that we try and find funding, and we craft this into a book style, may use the same, just the format. And we print about 300 copies. And we attach a letter to this document and get it to the 200 organizations that say they want to support blacks. Let it get it to many MPs and MPPs and church leaders. My brother has access to 350 pastors. He may not hear this, but I hope he does. He has access to 350 pastors. I'm saying, pick 10 of the best ones, the brightest minds. We'll put a letter on it. We'll send them a copy. We'll re-release it if we have to. Whatever we have to do, because this is not anything that has been done before in the history of black civilization. If anyone thinks that's not so, bring the manifesto that was written by any group of scholars anywhere on the planet, that seeks to bring an understanding to black disempowerment and to how we can empower blacks and not just empower but sustain them. The reason why we use 50 years, because we took 50 years got us to this point, and we are unempowered, we are disempowered. But I also looked at in parallel that the fourth industrial revolution would probably take about 50 years to totally transform the world. So we have to be in various stages of readiness. So it doesn't mean that it's going to take 50 years, because I already said that in 5 years we want IPOs going out, right? So the 50 years is just tracking along with the Industrial Revolution. And what we are saying, that the next 5 generations, no, I was even better than that. I would say the next generation, if we say 10 years is a generation. So in 2031, all the crying should stop. The marching should stop. All this moaning and groaning should stop. All this crying over soup should stop. We should start weaning off the breasts of government. Okay? Drinking milk. We should start weaning off a little bit and start eating meat and solid foods. Meaning that we should be transitioning to. Remember, this is all taxpayers' money. So we have no reason to feel shy or embarrassed that we are getting funding. But what we are asking for, like any other corporation, is research and development funding so that we can be free to be creative and innovative. We do it to corporations. My wife has worked in many corporations where they got research and development funding to develop products. When you develop products, everybody benefits. The corporation, the community, hiring, the government benefits. Why not us? There's something wrong about the way we are treated as human beings on this planet. And we are silly to not understand that we are at a critical moment. And God has sent us 2 great men to present some form of leadership. I don't essentially want to be a leader of any organization. That's why I don't belong to charitable organizations, period. And I don't want to be leader of any company which I could create if I wanted. The reason being is I already have a corporation, 17 of us. My wife and I, 5 kids, 10 grandkids, and a great-grand. So I have a corporation to run. Do I have time for anything else? The answer is no. This is a serious corporation. This is a dead serious corporation I have to run. And I'm sitting here and standing here, I'm thinking about day and night. Every night I pray before I go to bed that my corporation can stick together and can achieve the greatest. So,
I think that is an excellent place to wrap up.
Yeah.